I think it's pretty safe to say that I'm a big fan of Haruki Murakami. If you've ever wanted to get into him, or if you've been looking for some new media recommendations, then here you are. A guide to Murakami and his books from a big fan of his. And today, I'm gonna be putting it simply to you. I would say that there are two types of Murakami books. There's the stories that are grounded and set in the real world, and then there are those that are set in a more fantastical setting. There's no real There's no real right way to get into Murakami, and I don't think there is really any right way to get into really any hobby or activity or artist body of work. But the way I got into Murakami was I read Norwegian Wood first about 7 years ago, probably, maybe 8. I reread it over and over again. I didn't get bored of it per se, but I just wanted more of his work. I wanted to hear more of his voice in a different context. So I read Kafka on the Shore next after that. It has more fantasy elements. It's more fantastical and more dreamlike in the sense that it was more surreal and less grounded, even though it takes place in our world than the real world. I'm not a big fan of Kafka on the Shore. Coming from Norwegian Wood, I didn't really like the subplots that were more fantastical and more surreal and less grounded. And I don't want to spoil any of the books I talk about today, but I also really didn't like that one other big part of the book. If you know, you know. Before I read Norwegian Wood, I didn't know anything about Murakami beyond the one Norwegian Wood movie adaptation that apparently isn't very good. I still haven't watched it yet. But I will say, as a tangent, the soundtrack is amazing. Shoutouts to Johnny Greenwood of Radiohead. Let me know if you guys would like to see a guide to Radiohead similar to this guide, because they're my favorite band ever. Anyways, I pretty much knew nothing about him beyond Norwegian Wood's premise and that film adaptation's existence. I just assumed he only wrote grounded romance novels because of that, and had no knowledge or awareness that any of his novels contain any fantasy or surreal dream-like elements and settings. But for reading these two books as the first two experiences of Murakami's work, I was able to gain a general sense or feeling of which of the two types of settings he writes with that I liked more, and I really prefer his grounded ones that take place in our world. More on that later though. I would say, I guess the pipeline that I went down, starting with Norwegian Wood, then Kafka on the Shore, both books give you a pretty good overall sense of Murakami's books and writing style. Most people, I think, start with Norwegian Wood because it's his most famous book, but really though, again, I don't think there's any right way or order to read his books, but I would say definitely do not start with Colorless Sikasa though. Just don't, it's a lot. I would say Norwegian Wood in general is a good way of getting a rough understanding of what Murakami's writing style is like. I'm talking about like the book alone by itself. If you only read that, it's almost like a caricature or a simplification, a condensation of how he writes. It's like listening to a greatest hits compilation album of a music artist or band in regards to his writing style. It pretty much gets across a general sense of how he conveys emotion, how he describes settings, how he writes his characters or doesn't, and how he structures the events in his stories or doesn't. More on that later. If you do read those two books first, hopefully, like me, you'll be able to find out which of the two you like more and go from there. As a late disclaimer, I've not read everything he's published, but here is what I have written by him on screen right now. And here's what I haven't read by him. Embarrassing! Yeah. I've been meaning to tackle and take on 1Q84 ever since my first reading of Norwegian Wood, and I actually bought my physical copy of 1Q84 almost right after I finished Norwegian Wood. It's probably his second most well-known book. I mean, I would say the big three when it comes to Murakami are Norwegian Wood, 1Q84, and Kafka on the Shore. I learned about 1Q84 naturally while I was reading Norwegian Wood, and I had gotten recommended it by a friend further, which made me decide to pick it up, and apparently never actually read it as of now. To be fair though, it is 3 books. It is a whole trilogy. It's a big commitment with a capital C. As you saw earlier, I have read a lot of his stuff. After my first encounter with his work 7 years ago, what made me stick around with his work for this long, and what do I find so enduring about his writing style and his work? For me, as said earlier in the video, I'm not really a big fan of any of his books or stories that take place in environments that aren't set in the real world, like These ones, for example. What I love about his work generally is that he has an immaculate way of describing and conveying emotions and sentiments of all kinds with just such crystal clear clarity. I think Norwegian Wood is pretty chock full of examples, but I don't think they contain the best examples of this. I think stories like Kina from Men Without Women or Colorless Tsukasa, arguably like his most depressing book, have examples that are much more exemplary of this and are also much more intense in emotion and emotional depth. Another reason why I love his writing style generally is that he writes with an almost childlike wonder and newfound amazement with the world. More so a deep and profound appreciation for other people and the relationships you have with them, simple pleasures in life and the world around you, and how all three interact with each other on a day-to-day basis. I think his clarity in describing emotions and sentiments communicates this intense and positive wonder so well, and that's what makes his work so incredibly infectious and enduring to me. Stories in The Elephant Vanishes or Men Without Women, for example, are probably the best examples I can think of in this regard, and because of that, I would read about anything or most anything if Murakami were writing about it, to be honest. The amount and skill of communication he possesses is incredible, and I think those two skills, for really any writer, is incredibly transferable to any genre or topic of interest. But I said most anything because there's some things that I really don't like about him. To paraphrase what Kanye once said, the biggest haters are the biggest fans. So as someone who's read his books over 7 years continuously, what do I not like about his stories? One of my biggest gripes is that he doesn't really plan his narratives out well. In the same way with Stephen King's stories, sometimes having great premises but not necessarily the best endings, Murakami's stories often start out very strongly with a good amount of promise and often dwindle around the halfway point or two-thirds in, with an either subpar ending or a very disappointing ending. You can tell that he just makes stuff as he's writing and he forgets things often. Like the biggest and most blatant example I can think of is how Norwegian Wood starts off with the main character Toru in an airport in the present day, where he's recalling his past as a university student. The whole book is one big flashback. It's supposed to be one whole big flashback that Toru is telling us in the airport. But the book just never addresses that again. It never brings that up. And even at the end, it just ends. It doesn't go back to Toru in the airport at all. It just ends in the flashback, you know? Like, it's almost as if, like Murakami has just left us trapped in this flashback, and he doesn't bring us back to the present day at all. It's almost as if, like, he forgot that the whole story started out in the airport. This is also why I don't really like his stories with more fantasy-based settings. It just seems like he doesn't have a solid grasp on them in general. And, like, sure, like, you could probably pass it off as soft world building, or some people might pass it off as that. But, I mean, there's a very big difference, I think, between not saying much about your world and understanding it to a great degree, and not saying much about your world because you don't understand it very well. You can say that Murakami starts guns blazing with his stories, or maybe perhaps a more accurate idiom to use would be cocks out, because Murakami has this almost intolerable but insatiable lust and libido that he just really needs to restrain and put down, and also needs to shut the fuck up about. All of his books, except his nonfiction works, have some amount of promiscuity, to some degree of intensity. Like, this man cannot shut up about sex, and I'm not even exaggerating. He writes in too many sexual fantasies and descriptions of sexual actions, objects, and particularly the bodies of women and females. And speaking of which, he's not even delicate or sensitive and considerate when he writes these sexual things. Most of the time, they're really raunchy, perverted, and really, really insensitive from a woman's perspective. Actually, it's just insensitive from anyone's perspective. Objectification is unfortunately a really big part of how he writes most of his female characters, and I really dislike that. If you ask any other Murakami reader their opinion of his writing, they'll most likely say he would be the perfect writer if he wasn't so sexist and if he planned his narratives out properly. And it can definitely be frustrating sometimes, especially when clearly it doesn't fit the story beats or progression of events that have happened so far. And it's just been very obviously shoehorned in by Murakami because he felt like, well, I'm over here stroking my dick. It can be quite distracting. But that being said, the sort of energy that he weaves through his narratives does make Murakami. And I think any intensely emotional, passionate person would feel all emotions, including lust and love quite strongly and maybe equally. But there is no excuse for blatant misogyny, especially misogyny that has not been approached from a self-aware, wary, commentary or critique-like perspective. In 2017, Meiko Kawakami, basically the female equivalent of Murakami, interviewed him in 2017 about if the way he writes female characters is through their perspective, the character's perspective, and he basically said, no, that's how I actually think about women. So let's say that you've read everything by Murakami, or you're just looking for something more. Where do you go from here? Well, I would highly recommend Drive My Car, the 2021 film directed by Ryusuke Hamaguchi. I don't think a film adaptation of a story can be any more perfect than this. Not only is the dialogue so true to Murakami's ethos and writing style, but so are the visuals. Incredibly meditative, reflective, clean, beautiful with an intense amount of poignant emotional charge. It's not just an adaptation of the short story from Men Without Women. Hamaguchi also integrated and included other stories from the anthology as subplots to weave into the main narrative to enhance it further, and it works just so well. Please just do yourself a favor and watch it when you have 3 hours to spare, if you have the time. I mean, it's a big commitment, but honestly, maybe as a Murakami fan, it might be the best 3 hours of your life so far. In terms of books though, I haven't really found any author who has a voice like Murakami's yet, but if you like the existential discussions, topics, and sentiments he often brings up, then I can only really think of someone like Mitch Albom. He does also seem to have a similar profound appreciation for life and the people that are close to us. And he also does have stories that are set in more slightly fantastical settings than our world, but I think he does a better job at them than Murakami, because he fleshes them out a bit more, and it's like he actually knows what's going on. He also actually plans his narratives, and they're solid throughout with no real plot holes and no loose story-related ends. Tuesdays with Mari and The 5 People You Meet in Heaven are 2 of his most famous books. I've read both, and you really can't go wrong with either, but I highly recommend For One More Day. It made me weep in the best possible way upon my first read. I'm saying that as if I've read this multiple times. I've only read it this one time because it was just too much. I'd say just go into it blind. You could probably finish it in a day if you work through all the waterworks. Oh, and Album is not sexist like Murakami, to my knowledge, which is very good. In his books, at least, he's very sensitive and considerate towards all his characters and their circumstances, and he actually writes women and females like people, not like sexy sex objects for a boing boing cock. A book that people cite as Murakami-like is If Cats Disappeared from the World by Genki Kawamura. Genki Kawamura. If you like these books by Murakami, then you most likely like this too. I didn't like it for reasons stated earlier with Murakami books like that, and also in the book personally, I found there to be some emotional detachment and distance from life and close people in my lives in the writing style. Kawamura is not as intense or vivid or as passionate and existential in energy as Murakami, and because I find that to be Murakami's strongest attribute as a writer, I didn't like it as much. But the premise is existential, and the narrative is arguably planned more concretely than most Murakami books, and there's also no insensitive depictions of women either. Incredible! So that was a guide to Murakami. I hope you liked it and found it helpful, and everything I talked about today has been just from my experiences and my perspective. If you have any recommendations for Murakami-like books, or perhaps which Murakami book I should start reading next, please comment down below. You already know I'm a huge fiend for Murakami, so please don't hesitate. I'm just always looking. Again, let me know if you want me to do a similar guide like this, but for Radiohead, because they're my favorite band ever, and I would love to do anything like related to them. I'm Johnny, and I hope today I was putting it simply to you. Thanks!